Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be working on two chibi drawings. This first drawing is me as a chibi. I wanted to create a chibi of myself that looked more like me. I chose not to show the sketches for the drawings, so we are starting the video with line art. Line art is not my favorite thing to do. It takes a long time for me and I sometimes redraw certain lines over and over again. I do have stabilization turned on my line art brush. Basically, stabilization just helps your brush to be steadier as you draw, so that way you won't get a bunch of shaky lines. This works for most of my drawings where the line art has to be a little more precise, but it doesn't always work with me when I want a looser look. I fidgeted a lot with the line art. There was so much adjusting and moving things around that it got the line art fuzzy, so I went over the line art again after I had finished it. So I'm back from my break. I'm going to be trying to post a video once a month for right now. To me, this seems like an easier schedule to keep up with instead of trying to post every other week. I'm also going to be making some changes to my profile picture and banner, and I'm looking forward to getting to continue to share my art with you all. The coloring portion didn't take up a ton of time. Once I had the colors down, I used a brush to make different colored splatters on the jacket and shirt. These splatters are supposed to be paint splatters. I like to paint, especially with acrylics, so some of my clothes are paint stained. After that, I moved on to shading. I made a layer above my color layer, made it a clipping mask, and set it to multiply. This is how I usually shade. It makes everything a little bit easier. I tend to use muted purples or pinks for my shading colors. I started with cell shading and added it where I thought it made sense. I don't have a ton to say about this. I've been wanting to work on my chibi art style recently. It just felt like it was lacking some things. For one, I want to start defining the hands a bit more. It adds a little more detail. The next is the proportions. I want them to have the same proportions I use for my other art style. I like how it looks. I also want to start adding a little more to the shading and highlighting. I think adding a little bit of blended shading helps add some more detail. I like the balance of a simpler drawing with the right amount of details. Once I finished the cell shading, I made another layer above the color layer, made it a clipping mask, and set it to add, and I used this for the highlights. After the shading and highlights, I added in some more shading and highlights and used Gaussian blur to blend it out, and then I added a background. And here is my chibi. I like how she turned out. For the next chibi, I wanted to do something a little bit different from the first one. I recently started looking at cake decorating videos, and I found my way to a video of someone decorating cupcakes with a tip that could make mini flowers. It was later that day that I had the idea for this drawing. The idea was to draw a girl with a piping bag piping flowers on a cupcake. It's a simple idea, but it sounded so cute, so I decided to draw it. I will say, I did not expect the flowers to take me as long as they did, and it was one of the most time-consuming parts of this entire drawing. At first, I thought I would make them look like the flower that the piping tip made, but I abandoned that idea and instead did my own thing. So the flowers just kind of have some wavy lines for their petals, but I think they pass for flowers. I ended up duplicating a fair amount of the flowers and just placing them on other areas of the cupcake. I figure I can get away with this since with a piping tip you can get a pretty similar shape each time for a flower. I think. I'm not a cake decorator, so I don't actually know how difficult it is to get certain things to look similar with piping tips. The flower I'm referring to is made by a 2D closed star piping tip. I really want to try decorating some cupcakes with this tip since the result turned out pretty in the video and it looked really fun to try out. What started this whole interest in cake decorating recently was a curiosity I had. Can you paint pour, but with cake decorating? By this, I mean, is there an edible version of paint pouring? I asked my mom this question and she mentioned a mirror glaze. I didn't know what that was until I started looking it up a day or so after my mom mentioned that. Basically, it's a shiny edible glaze that you can pour over a cake. It looks so cool and fun. I really want to make one after seeing some videos and pictures of mirror glaze cakes. From there, I ended up finding cake decorating videos and pictures and came across the flower that is made by a 2D closed star piping tip. And that is what inspired this drawing. For the coloring, I went with a vanilla color for the cupcake and red for the flowers with a yellow center. I kept the colors pretty simple for the girl. I like the green and the blue for her outfit. I think the colors look pretty. So let me explain the piping bag colors and the flower colors. In my search of cake decorating videos, I found some videos where people would use plastic wrap and then put down a layer of buttercream that was one color. Then they would add a smaller layer of a different colored buttercream on top of the previous layer, and then they would roll up the plastic wrap, cut off one end, and then put it in a piping bag that already had a piping tip in it. Then when they started piping, there would be two colors. I also saw a way to do this with a piping bag that didn't require using plastic wrap, and I also saw another video where they used 3 layers of buttercream instead of 2. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but the point is that it made me want to draw something similar to it. So I chose a pinkish red and a yellow for my flowers and the buttercream inside the piping bag. I don't think in reality you can actually see both colors in the piping bag, but I chose to show both colors in the drawing because it looked nice and it added a little bit more to the drawing. The shading process is the same as the first drawing. These flowers took so long. They were easier to shade though compared to the drawing process, but it got kind of boring after the first few flowers. I like to bake. There are so many cool and fun looking desserts like mirror glaze cakes, and they look fun to make. However, I don't always follow the recipe exactly, and I'm starting to realize the importance of following a recipe closely. Recently, I wanted to make some chocolate chip cookies and some white chocolate and walnut cookies, so I found a recipe and got out the ingredients I needed. I decided to half the recipe so that there weren't too many cookies. I thought everything would turn out fine when the cookies went in the oven, but no, they didn't really spread. I think the reason for this was not enough moisture was added. Technically, having the recipe should have resulted in normal cookies. However, the recipe did not factor in the fact that I don't level my flour, and I tend to guesstimate measurements on some things because I don't want to have to make an extra dish to wash. This all left me with some tasty yet odd looking cookies. So yeah, lesson learned. Just grab the proper measurements and level the flour. For highlights, I did the same thing as the first drawing, and after I finished those, I added some more shading and highlights, and this time I used my watercolor brush to blend out some of the shadows, and I also used Gaussian blur to blend out the shadows and highlights. The watercolor brush I used is just a modified version of the watercolor brush in the Procreate library, and it is one of my favorite brushes to blend with. It's pretty much the only brush I actually use to blend with. I just really enjoy how it looks, and I enjoy the effect it makes when shading. And here's my finished dessert chibi. I really love how she turned out. She just looks so cute. These drawings were both fun to create, and I love how they look. Let me know what you think of these drawings. Thank you for watching. God bless.